My grandma wasn't who I thought she was. After she died, I found out about her double life, and everything she was hiding came out, and then Oliver, 28, here. I'll start by saying my family has always been pretty close. I grew up with this huge sense of love and stability, and one of the biggest parts of that was my grandma, Rose. She was 85 when she passed, and I thought I knew everything about her. She was that warm, comforting grandmother who baked cookies, made everyone laugh, and always had this gentle, steady presence. My mom, Caroline, 55, was an only child, just like me, so it felt like the three of us were always this tight little unit. Grandma Rose had been widowed for as long as I could remember. My grandpa passed before I was born, and she'd never remarried or even hinted at another relationship. At least, that's what I thought. Her passing was peaceful. She went in her sleep, just as she'd always hoped. We gathered a few days later for her funeral, with close friends and family filling the small chapel where the service was held. Mom and I did most of the planning, trying to make it exactly how Grandma would have wanted. It was a beautiful, quiet ceremony, filled with the kind of gentle nostalgia she'd have appreciated. But then something happened that changed everything. Just as we were wrapping up, and people started heading to the reception, this man in his late 60s came up to us. He looked a little lost, scanning the room like he was looking for someone he recognized. At first, I thought he was just a distant friend or maybe an old acquaintance from my grandma's neighborhood. Then he walked right up to my mom and me, took a deep breath, and said, "Caroline, I'm so sorry for your loss. Rose was a wonderful woman." His voice cracked with this raw emotion that threw me off. It was like he was grieving as much as we were. But there was something else there, something like possessiveness. Like he wasn't just a guest. Mom and I exchanged a confused look. She thanked him, clearly not recognizing him, and introduced herself politely. He just stared at her for a moment, and I could see something flicker in his eyes. A mix of shock and maybe guilt. "I'm Isaac," he said, and then his words landed like a bomb. "Rose was my wife." The air around us went so still that for a second, I was sure I hadn't heard him right. My mom's face went pale, her hand coming up to cover her mouth as she stared at this stranger. Wife. Grandma Rose's husband had died decades ago. There was no way. "Excuse me?" My mom's voice was barely a whisper, but the disbelief and confusion were clear. Isaac hesitated, glancing around, probably realizing that he just turned this quiet funeral upside down. "Rose and I were married for over 30 years. He pulled a crumpled photo out of his pocket, and there, smiling right next to him in the picture, was my grandmother, looking years younger but unmistakably herself. Mom grabbed my arm, like she needed something to keep her steady. "There must be some kind of mistake," she said shakily, but Isaac shook his head. "I know this is a shock. I didn't expect, well, I thought maybe she'd told you." His voice was thick with sadness, and I realized he genuinely believed what he was saying. He started to explain, and the story he unraveled was something out of a soap opera. According to him, he and Grandma Rose had met in the early 80s, about 10 years after my grandpa passed. They'd fallen in love, and eventually, she'd married him. The thing was, they'd kept it completely separate from the life she had with us. She had a whole second family, another husband, a house, even a daughter named Emma who was in her early 30s. My mom's half-sister. As he spoke, I felt this twisting sensation in my stomach. I looked at my mom, and she was just standing there, frozen, staring at Isaac like he was speaking a foreign language. How could our grandma, our Rose, have hidden something like this? I glanced around, noticing the few people still hanging around were watching, whispering to each other. It was surreal, like the entire world had tipped sideways, and I was just standing there, trying to make sense of it. My mom finally found her voice. No, this can't be true," she stammered. But Isaac took out a ring, a simple gold band, worn and scratched. He looked at it like it was the most precious thing he'd ever owned. "She was my wife," he repeated softly, "and I thought I was her only family." For a second, I couldn't even breathe. The idea of Grandma having this other life, another family, people who thought of her the way we did, it didn't compute. I felt like I was in some terrible dream. "Why wouldn't she tell us?" I asked, the words barely forming. Isaac's eyes filled with tears, and he shrugged helplessly. I don't know. She always told me she had a complicated family history and that things would be too hard to explain. I didn't push because, well, I loved her. I thought I'd get to meet you all someday. His voice cracked, and for a moment, I actually felt bad for the guy. He'd been just as blindsided as we were. Isaac left the funeral quietly after that, but he gave us his number, saying he'd be happy to answer any questions we had. Mom and I were left in this daze, still trying to process what he told us. We drove home in complete silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. When we got to her house, she poured us each a glass of wine, and we sat at the kitchen table, staring at each other. Mom, I finally said, breaking the silence, what are we going to do? She shook her head, her eyes glassy with tears. I don't know, Oliver. I feel like I didn't even know her. It was hard to believe that this sweet, loving woman I'd always known could have been living a double life. I mean, she was my grandma. She'd been my rock, someone who taught me to cook, who cheered me on at every big moment in my life. And now I was supposed to believe she just created another life out of nowhere? Over the next few days, I kept turning everything over in my head. I'd lie awake at night, replaying the conversation with Isaac, wondering if he was telling the truth. There were so many questions, things that didn't make sense. Why hadn't she told us? Why the secrecy? My mom was even worse off. I'd never seen her so devastated. She barely ate, hardly slept, just sat around the house like she was waiting for someone to tell her it was all a mistake. She'd been so close to Grandma, trusted her completely, and now this had shattered everything she thought she knew. It didn't feel real. And yet, there was no denying the evidence. The pictures, the ring, the quiet grief in Isaac's eyes. My grandmother had hidden an entire family from us. But why? I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't leave this alone. If there was more to the story, I had to find out what it was. The days after the funeral were a blur of confusion and disbelief. Mom was in shock, and I was barely hanging on myself. We'd always had this simple, trusting relationship with Grandma Rose. She'd never been one for big secrets, or at least, that's what we thought. I spent hours trying to make sense of it all, the questions and hurt swirling through my mind. It was like I was seeing her ghost everywhere I looked, but instead of comforting me, it haunted me with questions I couldn't shake. Eventually, Mom and I decided we couldn't leave it alone. We had to know the truth. If Rose had led a second life, then maybe there were answers hidden somewhere in her things. So, we headed to her house, the cozy little place I'd grown up visiting every weekend, with its endless shelves of books and photos, the scent of lavender and old wood permeating every room. We started with her bedroom, combing through drawers, flipping through her journals, and checking every nook and cranny. Most of what we found was innocent enough. Old photos, little mementos from family trips, and birthday cards. But then, in a worn-out shoebox at the back of her closet, we found something that made my heart skip a beat. A stack of letters tied together with a faded pink ribbon. They looked like they were from decades ago, the envelopes yellowed and brittle. Mom and I exchanged a look before she picked up the first letter, unfolding it with shaking hands. It was dated 1983, a year before I was born. The handwriting was instantly recognizable, her neat, flowing cursive. But the words, they felt foreign. The letter was addressed to my beloved Isaac. Mom read it aloud, her voice breaking with each line. It was full of affection, warmth, and promises to be back soon and keep everything separate as we agreed. She mentioned a complicated arrangement and reassured Isaac over and over that she loved him deeply. She even signed it with, "Yours forever, Rose." The reality of it started sinking in. This wasn't just a fling or a fleeting romance. She lived a full, committed life with him. She was genuinely in love with this man. I felt a wave of anger and sadness hit me at once. She'd had a husband, another family, and we'd never known. All the times she'd left for personal trips or friend gatherings suddenly took on a different meaning. What do we do? I asked, feeling the weight of this strange new truth pressing down on me. Mom sat in silence, still holding the letters like they might disappear if she let go. I don't know, Oliver. I don't know how to even start making sense of this. For days, we kept digging, hoping to find something, anything that could explain her choices. We uncovered photos we'd never seen, tiny keepsakes, and postcards from places we never knew she'd visited. Each piece felt like another betrayal, like she'd left us in the dark for a reason we couldn't grasp. And then, one evening, as I was going through a stack of books in her attic, I found a small, worn journal. My heart raced as I opened it. This wasn't one of her usual gardening or cooking notebooks. This was a personal diary, and the first entry was dated back to 1981, the year she'd apparently met Isaac. The entries were careful, often vague, like she'd been afraid of writing down too much. She talked about meeting a wonderful man who understood her in a way no one else could. She wrote about love and happiness, but also about fear. Fear of losing us, her family, fear of judgment, and fear of hurting her daughter. She seemed to wrestle constantly with her decisions. One entry stood out more than the others. It was dated a year after she'd married Isaac, and she was writing about my mother. Caroline will never understand if she finds out. I'm afraid she'll hate me, and I can't bear it. I love Isaac, and I love my family. But sometimes, it feels like I'm living two lives, and I'm terrified that one day, it will all fall apart. What am I doing? Reading those words, I felt a strange mix of anger and pity. Part of me hated her for keeping this secret, for creating this web of lies that had suddenly become our burden. But another part of me could almost understand. She'd been scared. She'd been trying to hold onto everyone she loved without losing herself in the process. And in some twisted way, it had worked, until it didn't. I didn't tell my mom about the diary right away. She was already shattered, and I didn't want to add to her pain. Instead, I showed it to my best friend, Sam. He'd known my grandma well, too, and he was just as shocked as I was when I told him everything. Sam suggested that maybe meeting Isaac and his family might help us get closure, if they'd even agree to it. After a few days of thinking it over, I called Isaac. He answered right away, his voice cautious but hopeful, like he'd been waiting for this. Isaac, this is Oliver, I said. Rose's grandson. There was a pause. Oliver, thank you for calling, he replied, his tone laced with relief. I know this is difficult, but I'd really like to meet you. I want you to know that Rose was. She was everything to me, too. Hearing him speak about her so tenderly was almost unbearable, but I swallowed my emotions. I think we need to meet. There are things I need to understand. He agreed, and we set up a time to meet him and his daughter, Emma. The thought of meeting her, my mom's half-sister, my aunt, felt surreal. She was someone I'd never known existed until a week ago, yet she was family. The day of the meeting, I was a wreck. Mom refused to come. She said she couldn't handle it yet. So it was just me and Sam for moral support. We met at a small, quiet cafe in town, the kind of place that felt neutral, safe. When we arrived, Isaac and Emma were already there, sitting quietly in a corner booth. They looked up as we approached, and I saw the tension in their eyes, like they were as nervous as I was. Isaac stood and extended his hand. Oliver, thank you for coming. I shook his hand, feeling the warmth and strength in his grip. He looked older than I remembered from the funeral, his face lined with grief and something deeper, maybe regret. Emma looked at me with a strange mix of curiosity and pain. She was in her early 30s, with Rose's green eyes and a hint of the same smile. It was eerie to see pieces of my grandma in a stranger, someone I should have known but didn't. We sat down, and there was a long, awkward silence before I finally spoke. I don't even know where to start. Isaac looked down, fidgeting with a napkin. I don't know how much you want to hear, Oliver, but I'll tell you everything I can. I loved your grandmother, and she loved all of you. She felt trapped. Like she had to split herself to keep everyone happy. Emma nodded, her voice soft. She was an amazing mom. I always knew there was something she wasn't telling me, but I never imagined it was this. She reached out to show me a photograph she'd brought. It was Rose, a bit younger than I'd ever seen her, standing beside a little girl I now knew was Emma. She looked so happy, so relaxed in a way I'd never seen. It was like looking at a stranger who wore my grandma's face. The conversation that followed was raw and painful. Isaac explained that he and Rose had lived in quiet bliss, but she'd always felt torn. She would disappear for weeks, sometimes months, to spend time with us. I asked him how he could be okay with that, and he looked at me with a sad smile. When you love someone, you learn to accept the parts of them that don't make sense, he said quietly. I knew she had a past, and I chose to believe in the life we had together. Maybe that was foolish, but I couldn't imagine life without her. Hearing that broke something inside me. Rose had lived her life divided, always having to choose between two worlds. And here we were, the two halves of her life, trying to piece together who she really was. It had been a few days since that surreal meeting with Isaac and Emma, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still missing pieces of the puzzle. Sitting across from them had been like looking through a window into another life. My grandmother's other life. The one she'd kept hidden from us all. There was so much left unsaid. So many questions that still haunted me. Who was Rose, really? Why had she felt the need to keep this other family secret from us? Mom was still reeling, barely able to bring herself to talk about it. She'd looked through some of Grandma's letters and old mementos, but each piece seemed to add more confusion and heartbreak rather than answers. I could see how deeply she felt the betrayal. This was her mother, after all, the woman she'd relied on, trusted, and looked up to her whole life. Now, it felt like everything she knew was unraveling. I'd become restless, spending hours at Grandma's house, sorting through every box, every stack of papers, every hidden corner. Sam came by often, sitting with me in the dusty attic as I pored over old photos, receipts, and cryptic notes. I was hoping to find something that might make sense of it all, a reason for her choices that would help us understand. One evening, as I was going through another stack of photos, I found an album tucked away in the back of her wardrobe. The cover was worn, and there was no label on it, just a plain, dark blue leather binding. I opened it, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. The first photo was of a younger Rose, looking happier than I'd ever seen her, standing with a group of people. My eyes were immediately drawn to a familiar face, Isaac, looking younger and more carefree, his arm draped around her shoulders. As I flipped through the pages, I saw photo after photo of Rose's life with Isaac and Emma. They weren't grand or flashy. Most were simple moments, them at the beach, Rose cooking in a small, unfamiliar kitchen, her and Isaac dancing in what looked like a backyard. In some photos, she looked almost like a different person, carefree and playful in a way I'd never seen. It was like seeing a side of her I'd never known, a side she'd kept hidden, even from us. There was one particular photo that stuck with me. Rose and Emma, probably around Emma's 10th birthday, laughing as they blew out candles on a cake. I realized this was a birthday I'd never known about, a celebration that existed in a life completely separate from the one I'd been part of. I couldn't shake the feeling of sadness and betrayal, but also a hint of something else, a strange sympathy for the impossible life she must have lived. I knew then that I had to speak to Emma again. There was something about her that felt like the key to understanding this puzzle. I texted her, asking if she'd be willing to meet up, and she agreed almost immediately. She suggested we meet at a park near her house, a quiet place with benches along a small lake. When I arrived, Emma was already there, sitting by the water. She looked nervous, her fingers twisting together, but she smiled when she saw me. I sat beside her, and for a moment, we just watched the ducks glide across the water, neither of us knowing quite how to start. "Thanks for meeting me again," I said, breaking the silence. She nodded, glancing at me with those familiar green eyes, so much like Rose's. "I'm glad you reached out, Oliver. I've been thinking about all this too. It's like I can't stop wondering about her, you know? Wondering what she was really like, with you." The question caught me off guard. She was a wonderful grandma. Loving, kind, and so steady. I never once thought she was capable of anything like this. Emma looked down, smiling sadly. I know. She was the same with me. She was always there, always making sure I felt loved. She was like a best friend and a mother all in one. It's just so hard to believe she had this whole other life. We shared stories, slowly piecing together our memories of her, each of us seeing a side the other had never known. Emma told me about how Grandma Rose used to take her on road trips, showing her different parts of the state, stopping at strange roadside attractions. She used to tell me stories about her childhood, Emma said softly. But looking back, I wonder how much of it was true. It was like we were peeling away layers of a person we both loved, only to realize we'd never fully known her. I wanted to ask Emma if she felt betrayed too, but something in her eyes told me she understood Grandma's choices in a way I was struggling to. Then she told me something that shook me even more. There was one thing she said to me when I was a teenager, Emma murmured. I was maybe 16, and we were out by the lake, just talking. She told me that sometimes you have to live in the shadows to protect the ones you love. I didn't understand it at the time, but I think maybe she was talking about you, about your family. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? Emma shrugged, her voice soft but intense. I think she was terrified of hurting any of us. Maybe she thought if she kept everything separate, she could keep us safe from each other, from the complications and the heartbreak. It was a strange kind of logic, and as twisted as it was, I could see how she might have convinced herself that living two lives was better than risking everything falling apart. But it didn't make it easier to accept. Just then, Emma pulled out a small, worn envelope from her bag. She handed it to me, her fingers trembling slightly. I found this in her things, she said. It's addressed to you. My heart pounded as I took the envelope. It was sealed, my name scrawled on the front in her familiar handwriting. I looked up at Emma, and she nodded encouragingly, so I carefully opened it and began to read. The letter was brief, but it cut deeper than anything I'd read so far. Dear Oliver, asterisk if you're reading this, then the secrets I kept have finally come to light. I can't tell you how much it pains me to know that I've hurt you and your mother. I never wanted any of this to cause you pain, but I know now that there was no way to avoid it forever, asterisk. Asterisk, you were always so precious to me, Oliver. I hope you know that I loved you with all my heart, even if it doesn't make sense now. There are things I can't explain, choices I made that even I don't fully understand. But please, know that it wasn't about hiding from you. It was about protecting you, asterisk. Asterisk sometimes. The hardest thing in life is knowing who to be when the world won't let you be all of yourself. I loved both of my families, and in the end, that love broke me more than I could ever say, asterisk. Asterisk, take care of your mother. She'll need you. And remember, no matter what, you were always my beloved grandson, asterisk. Asterisk with all my love. Grandma Rose, asterisk. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking and my vision was blurred with tears. Her words were raw, filled with regret and a love that felt almost unbearable in its intensity. Emma put her hand on my shoulder, offering silent comfort, and I realized that in this moment, I wasn't alone. I had family, a different family than I'd ever expected, but family all the same. As I folded the letter and placed it carefully back into the envelope, I felt a strange mix of closure and new beginnings. My grandmother's choices had shaped my life in ways I would never fully understand, and I knew that accepting them would be a long, painful process. But I also knew that I wasn't done searching. There was more to Rose's story, and ours, that I needed to uncover. When Emma and I finally parted ways that evening, we promised to stay in touch. We were family, after all, bound together by a woman who'd loved us both fiercely, even if imperfectly. And as I walked away, the letter heavy in my pocket, I felt a small glimmer of peace. Maybe I'd never have all the answers, but I had something just as precious, a chance to honor the memory of the grandmother I'd loved and, somehow, to embrace the woman she'd really been. After meeting with Emma, I felt like I'd peeled back yet another layer of my grandmother's life, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that there were more shadows lurking behind the memories. Grandma's words in the letter haunted me. Her regret, her love, the mystery behind her choices. They felt too cryptic, like she'd been guarding secrets even as she tried to explain herself. And now that I'd found Emma and her side of the family, I wondered what else my grandmother had hidden. In the days that followed, Mom started coming around to the idea of meeting with Isaac and Emma, as if she was finally ready to confront the painful truth. I didn't push her, knowing she needed time. Instead, I kept sorting through Grandma's things, hoping to find more answers, especially about this so-called protection she'd mentioned. What had Grandma Rose thought was so dangerous? One evening, as I was rummaging through a chest in the attic, I found an old, unmarked notebook shoved beneath a pile of blankets. I opened it cautiously, expecting more notes or perhaps another journal entry. But it wasn't filled with memories or reflections. Instead, it was a ledger, pages upon pages of financial records. I couldn't understand half of the entries, but one name kept appearing alongside substantial sums of money. Kenneth. The name was unfamiliar. He wasn't part of our family, as far as I knew, and I'd never heard Grandma mention him. But it was clear from the entries that she'd been transferring large amounts of money to this Kenneth person over the years. I flipped through the pages, heart racing, trying to make sense of the transactions. Why would Grandma Rose have been sending money to a stranger, and why so regularly? Feeling a surge of panic, I called Sam. He'd become my unofficial investigator in all this, helping me make sense of the increasingly complicated web of Grandma's life. He arrived in less than an hour, looking both curious and concerned. "Look at this," I said, showing him the ledger. He scanned the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. "This is weird, man. Really weird. Do you think Kenneth was, blackmailing her or something?" he asked. The thought sent a chill through me. Had Grandma been paying someone off all these years? But if so, why? And why hadn't she told anyone? We pored over the notebook together, trying to piece together a possible explanation. Eventually, Sam suggested we try looking up Kenneth in some old public records. Maybe he'd left a trace somewhere. After some late-night internet digging, we found a few mentions of a Kenneth, somebody who matched the location where my grandmother had lived for part of her life. To my shock, we discovered that Kenneth had a criminal record. Back in the late 60s, he'd been involved in several unsavory dealings, fraud, forgery, and, worst of all, something called coercion charges, though the details were hazy. It was just enough information to set my mind spinning. Had Grandma somehow been caught up with this man? The implications were disturbing, yet they explained some of the strange fear and secrecy she'd hinted at in her letter. But there was still too much I didn't know. So, I took a deep breath and told my mom about the ledger and Kenneth. She was shocked, of course, and the news seemed to stir something inside her, a glimmer of a memory that she hadn't thought about in years. "Oliver, I don't know for sure, but I think Kenneth might have been someone from her past, before she met your grandfather," she said slowly, as if speaking the words could break some delicate spell. "She once mentioned a man she'd been involved with, someone who'd hurt her in ways I couldn't imagine. She said she'd left him behind, that she was free, but she never gave me details." I felt a wave of anger and pity crash over me. If Kenneth had been someone she'd once cared about but who'd turned into a threat, it would make sense that she might keep that part of her life hidden, even from us. And perhaps that threat had never really gone away. She'd just learned to live with it, to protect her family from whatever he'd held over her. Mom's voice broke me out of my thoughts. "Oliver, maybe this is why she felt the need to keep her two lives separate. Maybe he was the reason she created that distance, even from us." It was all starting to add up, albeit in a heartbreaking way. Grandma hadn't lived a double life just for the sake of it. She'd done it to shield both her families from this man and whatever hold he had on her. The thought left me both horrified and oddly comforted, as if finally understanding her reasons offered a sliver of peace. Determined to get closure, Mom agreed to meet with Isaac and Emma to see if they knew anything about this Kenneth. We arranged a time to visit them at their home, a modest, welcoming place on the outskirts of town. When we arrived, I noticed that Isaac looked weary, as if the burden of Grandma's secrets had weighed on him for years. Emma greeted us warmly, but there was a hint of apprehension in her smile. She knew this meeting would be difficult, and she was right. After exchanging polite greetings, we got straight to the point. I handed Isaac the ledger, explaining everything we'd found, and asked if he knew who Kenneth was. Isaac's face drained of color, and he exchanged a troubled look with Emma. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "Yes, I knew about Kenneth. Rose told me about him years ago. He was a threat, a shadow from her past, someone she feared would resurface," he admitted. "She said that he'd done terrible things, and that even after she left him, he held secrets over her that she couldn't risk exposing. She never told me what they were, but I knew they weighed heavily on her." Emma looked at her father, confused. "You never told me any of this, Dad." Isaac sighed, guilt filling his gaze. "I didn't want you to know, Emma. Your mother. She wanted to keep you safe from it all. But I suppose the truth had to come out eventually. Isaac then told us that Rose had only married him after ensuring that Kenneth had no way of finding her. She'd moved to another state, changed her routine, and did everything she could to erase herself from his world. Isaac had been her safe haven, her escape. The family they built was her sanctuary, and the last thing she wanted was for Kenneth's poison to seep into it. So she kept her lives separate, I murmured, feeling the pieces fall into place. Because she was protecting us. All of us. Mom's eyes welled up with tears, and she placed a hand on Isaac's. I had no idea she was carrying this weight. I wish she'd told me. Isaac nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. She loved you both deeply. She used to talk about you, Caroline, and you, Oliver. She wanted nothing more than to be fully present in both of your lives. But she believed it was safer this way, even if it tore her apart. Emma looked at me with teary eyes, and I felt the unspoken connection between us. We both had been a part of Rose's divided world, both victims of her past that we couldn't change. She'd lived her life in fear, yet she'd loved us enough to bear it alone. After that evening, things began to settle into a strange kind of acceptance. We'd uncovered her secrets, exposed the hidden fears, and untangled the knots she'd left behind. But the truth didn't bring easy relief. It just left us all with a greater sense of understanding and a bittersweet ache that only time could heal. As we sat together that night, sharing memories and stories of Rose, I realized that she hadn't been a perfect woman. She'd been flawed, like all of us, and she'd made painful, difficult choices that left scars. But she'd done it out of love, even if that love had come at a price none of us could have anticipated. When we finally left Isaac and Emma's house, I felt a quiet sense of closure settle over me. I knew we still had some healing to do, and that the journey of understanding Rose would never truly end. But we'd found the answers we needed, the shadows that had haunted her, the reasons she'd hidden her heart. For the first time in weeks, I felt a fragile sense of peace. Grandma Rose had kept her two lives separate, yes, but she'd done it with love, fierce and protective, flawed but genuine. And in the end, maybe that was enough. In the days following our meeting with Isaac and Emma, things felt strangely lighter. Grandma Rose's secrets had finally come to light, and while they had left us raw and broken in some places, there was a sense of peace settling in. Mom and I continued to go through her things, but now it was less about uncovering mysteries and more about understanding who she really was. We were finally seeing her, not as the perfect grandmother or mother we'd idealized, but as a woman who'd fought hard to protect her family in the only way she knew how. One day, while sorting through the last of her papers, I found a letter hidden in an old book. It was addressed simply, to my family, and I knew immediately it was her final message to us all. Mom and I read it together, and I felt a rush of emotions as her words revealed the truth we'd been piecing together. Asterisk, if you're reading this, you must know by now the secrets I kept. I know you may never fully understand, but know that every choice I made was out of love. Kenneth was a darkness in my past, one I could never shake. I created two lives to keep that shadow at bay, to protect each of you from the pain I carried. I'm sorry for the hurt I caused, and I hope one day you'll forgive me. Remember me not just for my mistakes, but for the love I tried to leave you all. Asterisk. Her words left a bittersweet ache in my heart. She'd carried so much alone, making impossible choices to shield us from a life she'd hoped to leave behind. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of respect for her resilience and her love. As I finished the letter, I knew that, despite everything, I could forgive her. She was flawed and complicated, like all of us, and though her choices had left us wounded, they were made with the best of intentions. Grandma Rose had been a woman divided by her own love, but she had given us a legacy, one of love, sacrifice, and a fierce determination to protect family, no matter the cost. And for that, I would always remember her.